You've seen hot air balloons drifting over some field, looking all peaceful and Instagrammable. Well, plot twist. The whole thing was invented by two paper guys who had absolutely no clue how it worked, and genuinely believed smoke itself had magical lifting powers. And the very first passengers? A sheep, a duck, and a rooster who did not sign up for this. So let's rewind to France in the 1780s. Picture two brothers, Joseph and Etienne Montgolfier. And before you start imagining two brilliant scientists in a lab covered in chalkboards and equations, let me stop you right there. These guys made paper. That was it. That was the entire family empire. The Montgolfiers ran a paper mill. They were basically the 18th century equivalent of a stationery store. Not exactly the resume you'd expect from the founding fathers of human flight. Now Joseph was the dreamer of the two. The kind of guy who forgets to eat because he's too busy staring at random stuff. And one day, he's sitting by the fire and he notices something. Little bits of ash and burnt paper floating up out of the flames. A normal person sees that and thinks, neat. Joseph sees that and has a full existential meltdown. What force is lifting these? Why does smoke go up? And instead of just looking it up, because it's 1782 and the internet is 200 years away, he decides the smoke must contain some kind of special magical gas. A brand new element that nobody has ever discovered. He literally invents a fake substance in his own head and gives it a name. He calls it Montgolfier gas. Bro named a non-existent gas after himself. Spoiler, there is no Montgolfier gas. What Joseph was actually looking at was just hot air. Heat makes air expand. Expanding air gets lighter than the cold air around it, and lighter stuff floats. That's the whole secret. That's it. It's the same reason a balloon flies today, and the same reason the ceiling in your room is always warmer than the floor. But Joseph didn't know any of that. He thought he had discovered wizard smoke, and honestly, respect the confidence. So he does what any reasonable maniac would do. He grabs a small silk bag, holds it upside down over a fire, and watches it puff up and float toward the ceiling. And his brain just breaks. It works. The magic smoke works. He runs to his brother Etienne like, dude, we have to build a bigger one. And Etienne, the responsible one, the one who actually ran the business, looks at his brother holding a smoking bag and goes, yeah, okay, let's do it. Which tells you everything about how these two operated. Here's the part that's genuinely hilarious. They still didn't understand it was hot air. Like, at all. They thought the secret ingredient was the smoke. So the more disgusting the smoke, the better it worked, in their heads. They started experimenting with what to burn to make the strongest possible lifting smoke. And they landed on a combination that is absolutely unhinged. Straw, wool, and chopped up old shoes. And later, when they wanted extra power, they threw in rotting meat. Because they figured the nastier the smell, the more magical the gas. So the revolutionary flying machine was powered by a bonfire of literal garbage. The birth of aviation smelled like a barbecue held inside a dumpster. Now they start scaling up. First they build small models out of paper and silk, little tabletop balloons. And these things actually fly, which only makes them more delusional about the whole magic gas theory. So they go bigger, and bigger, until they build a proper balloon out of sackcloth lined with 3 thin layers of paper, held together with roughly 2,000 buttons. Yes. Buttons. The first serious flying machine in human history was buttoned together like a giant floating coat, and in June 1783, in their hometown of Annonay, they decide to do a public demo. And this is where you have to appreciate the audacity. They invite a crowd of local officials and important people to come watch a giant paper sack filled with garbage smoke float into the sky. No safety plan, no idea what happens next, just vibes. They light the fire, the balloon fills up, it strains against the ropes, and then boom, they let go. And this thing rises, higher and higher, over 1,000 meters into the air. The crowd is losing their minds. People are screaming. And the balloon just casually floats away for about 10 minutes before landing a couple kilometers away, where it promptly catches fire, because obviously. But it worked! It actually worked! And suddenly, the two paper guys from a small French town are famous. Now here's where it gets even messier, because the Montgolfiers weren't the only ones in the balloon game. Word of their trash smoke miracle reached Paris, and a proper scientist named Jacques Charles heard about it and basically went, "Cute, but you're doing it wrong." See, Charles actually understood chemistry. He knew about a gas called hydrogen, which is genuinely lighter than air. Real science. No wizard smoke required. So while the Montgolfiers were still burning old boots, Charles built a completely different balloon filled with hydrogen. And to be fair to him, it worked way better. But building it was its own nightmare. To make enough hydrogen, they had to dump nearly 500 pounds of iron into barrels of acid, which took days, generated so much heat the whole rig kept overheating, and produced a gas that could explode if you so much as looked at it wrong. The birth of aviation was a competition between one team burning garbage and another team brewing acid bombs. And when Charles launched his unmanned hydrogen balloon in August 1783, it flew beautifully for about 45 minutes, and then landed in a village called Gonesse, several kilometers outside Paris. And the local peasants had never seen anything like it. To them, this hissing, half-deflated silk creature falling out of the sky wasn't a scientific triumph. It was a monster, possibly a demon, possibly the moon itself falling down. So they did the only sensible thing. They attacked it, with pitchforks and knives and flails. They stabbed the balloon to death, tied the shredded corpse to a horse, and dragged it through a field until it was completely destroyed. The government literally had to start printing pamphlets afterward, explaining to the countryside, "Hey, if you see a giant floating bag, please do not stab it. It is science, not Satan." The early days of flight were so chaotic, they needed a public safety warning telling people to stop murdering balloons. Word travels fast. Like, ridiculously fast for 1783. All of this only made balloons more famous. It reaches the scientists, it reaches the salons, and most importantly, it reaches the king. King Louis XVI hears about this floating garbage bag and goes, "I need to see this." So the Montgolfiers get the ultimate invitation. Come to the Palace of Versailles. Do your balloon thing in front of the king, the Queen Marie Antoinette, and the entire royal court. Which is amazing. And also terrifying, because now the stakes are astronomical. If your homemade button balloon fails in front of the King of France, you don't get a participation trophy. You get humiliated in front of the most powerful people on earth. But here's the real problem they were sweating over. Somebody eventually raises the obvious question, what if we put a person in it? And nobody knew if that would work. Not because of the balloon. Because of the sky. See, at this point, no human had ever been more than a few meters off the ground on purpose. Ever. And there was a genuine, serious fear among scientists that the upper air might just kill you. Maybe there's no breathable air up there. Maybe the pressure crushes you. Maybe some invisible force just switches your body off. Nobody had data. Because nobody had ever gone up to check and come back. So they came up with a solution that is peak 18th century problem solving. Before we risk a human, let's send up some animals and see if they die. And not just any animals. They picked 3 very specific test pilots. And the logic behind each one is actually kind of genius, in a deeply messed up way. First, a sheep. Why a sheep? Because a sheep's body is roughly similar to a human's, physiologically speaking. So if the sheep survives, a person probably survives. The sheep was the stand-in for you and me. This sheep was, no exaggeration, the first crash test dummy in history, and they gave him a name, Montgolfier, which translates to, get this, climb to the sky. They named the sacrificial sheep after his own mission, cold. Second, a duck. Now this one's the control subject. A duck can already fly high without any problems, so if the duck gets hurt up there, they'd know it was the balloon doing something weird and not the altitude. The duck was the peer reviewer. And third, a rooster. Why a rooster? Because a rooster is a bird that does not fly high. It's a ground bird. So it was another control. If the rooster suffered but the duck didn't, they could compare and figure out what was actually going on. The rooster did not consent to being part of a science experiment, but here we are. So on September the 19th, 1783, at Versailles, in front of the king and queen and a crowd of 130,000 people, they load a sheep, a duck, and a rooster into a wicker basket underneath a giant, gorgeously decorated balloon. They light the trash fire. The balloon swells up, and they release it. And this basket full of confused, terrified farm animals lifts off the ground and climbs into the open sky in front of the entire royal court of France. The most historic launch in aviation history, and the crew was livestock. The balloon flew for about 8 minutes. It traveled around 3 kilometers. And then it came down in a nearby forest, and everyone is holding their breath. Are they dead? Did the sky kill them? People rush over to the crash site to check on the passengers, and the results are in. The sheep? Totally fine. Chilling. Not a scratch. The duck? Perfectly healthy. Living its best life. And the rooster? The rooster had a slightly injured wing, and for a second, everyone panics, thinking the altitude did it. But then they figure out the truth. The rooster's wing wasn't hurt by the sky. It got hurt because the sheep straight up kicked it before takeoff. That's it. The only injury of the entire first flight was one animal beating up another animal in the basket. The sky didn't hurt anybody. A sheep did. And this was the breakthrough. The animal survived. The sky was safe, which meant the next passenger could finally be a human. And now everybody wanted the honor of being the first person to fly. Even the king got involved. Louis XVI, being the king, suggested they use condemned prisoners for the first human flight. Just, send up some criminals, and if they die, no big loss. Classic monarchy energy. But a young scientist named Jean-François Pilatre de Rosier was horrified by that idea. He argued that the glory of being the first human to fly should not go to some prisoner. It should go to a brave volunteer, namely himself. He basically lobbied for the right to risk his own life first, which, in this era, counts as a flex. So on November the 21st, 1783, Pilatre de Rosier and a nobleman named the Marquis d'Arlandes climbed into a balloon in Paris. No animals this time. Just 2 guys and a whole lot of hope. And they took off. Free flight, untethered, rising over the rooftops of Paris. And it was genuinely dangerous, because remember, this thing is made of paper and fabric, and directly underneath it is an open fire. So while they're floating over the city, sparks keep flying up and setting the balloon on fire mid-flight, and their solution was to bring wet sponges and buckets of water, and just frantically slap out the flames while thousands of feet in the air. Imagine casually putting out fires on your own aircraft with a sponge while gliding over Paris. But they did it. They flew for about 25 minutes, crossed the city, and landed safely. The first humans had officially flown. And they did it standing on a burning basket, swatting flames with sponges. And it's worth sitting with just how insane that flight actually was. These 2 men were standing in a wicker gallery around the base of the balloon. And in the middle of that gallery was a burning firebox that they had to keep feeding with straw the entire time to stay in the air. So their job wasn't just to fly. It was to fly while running an open bonfire directly beneath a giant bag of paper and fabric, thousands of feet above a city, with no parachutes, no radio, no plan, and no idea if they'd survive. The Marquis d'Arlandes reportedly kept getting distracted by the beautiful view of Paris, and Pilatre de Rosier kept having to yell at him to stop sightseeing and put out the fires that were literally eating the balloon around them. One of them is having a spiritual moment admiring the rooftops. The other one is screaming, "Bro, we are on fire, grab the sponge." That's the actual dynamic of humanity's first flight. France went absolutely feral for balloons after this. It became a full-blown craze. They called it ballomania. And it was everywhere. People put balloon designs on their plates, their hats, their clothes, their furniture, their snuff boxes, everything. The Montgolfiers became legends. 2 paper salesmen who accidentally kicked off the entire history of human flight because one of them refused to accept that smoke wasn't magic. But here's the twist, and it's a dark one. Remember Pilatre de Rosier? The brave guy who volunteered to be the first human in the sky instead of letting a prisoner do it? Well, being the first is addictive. And a couple years later, he decided to attempt something even bigger, crossing the English Channel by balloon. And to do it, he designed a new balloon that combined a hot air section with a hydrogen section, which, if you know anything about hydrogen, is the single most flammable gas you could possibly choose. He put an open flame next to a bag of the most explosive gas in existence. and in 1785, shortly after takeoff, his balloon caught fire and exploded, and he fell to his death. Jean-François Pilatre de Rosier, the first person ever to fly, also became the first person ever to die in an aviation accident. He held both records, which is the most tragic possible way to be a pioneer. So the next time you book some cute little sunset hot air balloon ride and you're floating there feeling all romantic and serene, just take a second. Remember that this entire experience exists because a guy stared at a fireplace, hallucinated a magical gas that isn't real, burned a pile of old shoes and rotting meat to fly, and then sent a sheep, a duck, and a rooster into the sky as test subjects to make sure the air up there wouldn't kill you. The peaceful, beautiful, Instagram-worthy hot air balloon was built on garbage smoke, delusion, and one very brave, very unwilling farmyard crew. And honestly, that's a way better story than magic.